In the antediluvian era, before the flood, before recorded kingdoms, an event was said to occur at a specific mountain. The official explanation was simple. It was a myth, a symbolic story about human corruption. But one detail never made sense. Myths don't preserve location, they don't name mountains, and they don't survive across hostile cultures unless something real anchored them. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Why was Mount Hermon remembered when so much else was erased? History didn't disappear. It was rewritten. This is the broken truth. This is the Broken Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett. Today's episode is titled Mount Hermon, Where Heaven Crossed the Line. This is not about proving a theory. It's about examining a story that was declared symbolic, filtered through doctrine, and quietly sidelined, and asking, what happens when the questions don't go away? Because tonight's question isn't small. What really happened when the Watchers descended? And why was that location remembered long after the story was supposedly erased? If you ask most people, especially in modern Western religious culture, what Genesis 6 is about, they'll give you a clean, controlled answer. It's a warning story, a moral allegory, a snapshot of a world so corrupt that judgment followed. And in that mainstream reading, the strange phrase, sons of God, becomes a safe phrase. Something like powerful men, or the godly line, or simply human rulers. The point becomes ethical, not cosmic. This is what the public is told. The event summary goes like this. Ancient texts describe divine beings interacting improperly with humanity, and later traditions interpret that as metaphor. Over time, canon and doctrine frame the account as non-literal, and the dangerous parts are treated as interpretive errors, poetic exaggeration, or ancient superstition. The key institutions involved in this official explanation aren't a single agency the way they'd be in a modern cover-up story. They're a network. Canon formation, theological authority, institutional doctrine, and modern academic scholarship. So the official cause or explanation becomes a pipeline. Ancient myth to oral tradition to symbolic scripture, and finally, doctrinal clarification. And then the file is stamped, explained. Why does it sound reasonable? Because the modern mind has been trained to mistrust the ancient mind. We assume that ancient people encoded philosophy as myth because they lacked modern categories. We assume the supernatural language is symbolic because that's safer. Safer for doctrine, safer for credibility, and safer for stability. And treating it as metaphor does something else too. It removes responsibility, it removes geography, and it removes consequence. A metaphor can't be investigated. A metaphor can't be located. And a metaphor can't leave a footprint. That's the official narrative. Nothing to see here, only a lesson. But then we run into the fracture. To give you some expanded historical context, we have the Second Temple worldview, geography, and why Mount Hermon wasn't random. To understand why Mount Hermon refuses to disappear from the record, we have to step back into a world that did not think the way we do. Modern readers approach ancient texts with assumptions shaped by science, secularism, and post-Enlightenment categories. Ancient writers did not separate the world into natural and supernatural. They experienced reality as layered, visible and invisible, human and divine, earthly and cosmic, interacting constantly. In the ancient Near East, geography mattered because space itself was symbolic. Mountains were not just high ground, they were thresholds. Places where the boundary between realms was believed too thin. That worldview is not unique to Israel. It appears across Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and later Greco-Roman traditions. Mountains were meeting points, places of divine assembly, revelation, judgment, and covenant. And Mount Hermon fits that pattern with unsettling precision. The world of Genesis was not a closed system. When Genesis was written, or more accurately, compiled, it emerged from a cultural environment that assumed a populated unseen realm, not metaphorical forces, beings, authorities, and hierarchies. This is where the phrase sons of God would have raised eyebrows for an ancient audience. In the ancient worldview, that phrase referred to members of divine council, a structured hierarchy of non-human intelligences tasked with oversight. That worldview survives most clearly in the Hebrew Bible itself, even after later theology tried to smooth it out. The problem is not that Genesis 6 is vague. The problem is that later readers became uncomfortable with its clarity. The Second Temple Judaism didn't see this as a metaphor. Between roughly 500 BCE and 70 CE, the Second Temple period, Jewish thinkers did not treat the Watcher's story as symbolic. They treated it as historical theology. Texts from this era expand Genesis 6 rather than minimize it. They describe the Watchers as real beings who descended, violated boundaries, and introduced destabilizing knowledge into the human world. This matters because Second Temple Judaism is the intellectual environment that produced early Christianity. In other words, the people closest to the time did not read this as metaphor. They read it as a system failure. Knowledge was the crime, not just sex. Modern discussions often fixate on one detail: illicit unions. But ancient texts emphasize something else even more strongly: instruction. The Watchers are condemned, not only for crossing relational boundaries, but for teaching humanity things they were not authorized to teach: weapons, manipulation of nature, cosmetics and enchantments, astronomy and forbidden timing. In the ancient mind, knowledge is not morally neutral. Knowledge changes power dynamics. This is why the story isn't framed as romance gone wrong. It's framed as a breach of governance. And governance always implies jurisdiction, which brings us back to geography. Why Mount Hermon? Mount Hermon is not a symbolic location chosen at random. It is the highest mountain in the region, snow-capped, dominant, visible for miles. But more importantly, it sits at a cultural fault line. Hermon marks the northern boundary of ancient Israelite consciousness. Beyond it lay foreign powers, foreign gods, and contested territory. In ancient thought, borders mattered. They weren't just political, they were spiritual. And Hermon was a border mountain. That makes it the perfect place, symbolically and narratively, for a boundary violation. But symbolism alone doesn't explain why the name persisted. Naming is an act of memory. In ancient cultures, naming a place after an event was not decorative, it was archival. Names preserved memory when writing materials failed. They encoded warnings, they marked trauma, they remembered violations. The Watcher's tradition claims the mountain was named in connection with an oath. An oath is not poetic flair. An oath is a legal act. It binds participants. It creates consequences. It assumes authority. Symbolic myths don't need legal language, but historical memory often does. Later theology had a problem. As monotheism hardened, and as institutional authority became more centralized, the Watcher's story became inconvenient because it introduces too many uncomfortable ideas at once. That not all divine beings are loyal, that authority can fracture, that heaven is not monolithic, that humanity can be collateral damage in a larger conflict. Those ideas destabilize simple moral frameworks. So the story wasn't erased, it was just reframed. Reframing is safer than deletion. It preserves the text while neutralizing its implications. By the time formal doctrine solidified, the story could be tolerated, as long as it was no longer taken seriously. Geography refuses to cooperate, but geography doesn't obey doctrine. Mount Hermon remains, referenced, named, and revisited. It survives conquest, exile, canonization, and reinterpretation. Even later biblical texts continue to gesture northward when discussing cosmic rebellion, chaos, and hostile powers. That's not accidental, it's residue. This is how ancient history gets sanitized. What we are watching in real time is a familiar process. A disruptive event enters the record. Its implications threaten existing authority. Interpretation narrows. Metaphor replaces mechanism. Geography is minimized. Questions are discouraged. The story becomes safe. But safe stories don't need this much maintenance, and safe stories don't leave behind mountains that refuse to be forgotten. And this is where the official explanation begins to fail. Not because the story is strained, but because it is too specific. Because metaphors don't swear oaths, and myths don't keep pointing back to the same mountain. And that brings us to the fracture point. There's a moment where the explanation stops holding, and it happens at the preservation of Mount Hermon itself. Because if this was purely symbolic, if it was only an allegory, why does the story keep reaching for the same anchor? Not an idea, not a parable, a mountain. In one of the most influential non-canonical texts tied to the Watcher's tradition, 1st Enoch, the Watchers don't just fall. They make a decision. They coordinate. They swear. They bind themselves. And crucially, this isn't framed like myth floating in the clouds. It's framed like an operation with a location. 1st Enoch describes a group, 200, descending on the summit of Mount Hermon and naming it in connection with an oath. That's not how symbolic stories behave. Symbolic stories don't need sworn oaths with consequences. Symbolic stories don't obsess over a summit. Symbolic stories don't explain the name of a geographic feature as if they're preserving an origin. Now, we have to be careful. Naming a location doesn't automatically prove the event happened as described. Ancient literature can name places for rhetorical power. But here's the contradiction. The theological cleanup tries to strip the Watcher's narrative down to morality, while the oldest streams of the tradition keep insisting on place, oath, descent, and aftermath. The record becomes incomplete, not because we're adding speculation, but because the tradition itself shows signs of pressure, signs of discomfort, signs that someone, at some point, wanted the cosmic dimensions softened. And that's where the story changes, because once a story is linked to a place, it becomes harder to bury. Places can be revisited, places can be remembered, places can outlast the institutions trying to reframe them. Mount Hermon survives in the text like a fingerprint. Now, we move carefully. We're not here to preach a conclusion. We're here to examine the options and the costs of each option. Theory A, the symbolic interpretation. This is the mainstream position. It's supported by many theologians, seminaries, and religious institutions because it protects doctrinal stability. It keeps the story inside the boundaries of accepted theology: human sin, moral decline, divine judgment. The evidence cited is often literary. The way ancient Near Eastern texts use divine imagery, and the reality that Genesis, as we have it today, passed through the stages of compilation and editing over centuries. This view often offers several subversions. One popular strand interprets sons of God as the godly line of Seth, intermarrying with the corrupt line of Cain. Again, safe, moral, and human. And if you only read Genesis 6 in isolation, you can understand why people accept this. It's clean. It preaches well. It doesn't explode your worldview. But here's the criticism. It doesn't explain the geographic fixation. It doesn't explain why the tradition outside the Canaan carries the same structural shape: descent, oath, instruction, corruption, and judgment. And most importantly, it doesn't answer the unresolved issue. Why would symbolic stories require sworn oaths and named sites? A symbolic interpretation can explain evil grew. It struggles to explain the mountain was named because of an oath. So theory A is stable, but it may be incomplete. Theory B, the historical anomalous event. This theory doesn't claim we can reconstruct the event perfectly. It claims something else, that the Watcher's narrative preserves memory of an event later reframed. In this view, the tradition isn't just poetry. It's a record, filtered, mythologized, but anchored to something that occurred strongly enough to persist. Why has this gained traction? Because across fragmented ancient traditions, you keep seeing the same motifs: heavenly beings, forbidden unions, corrupted knowledge, giants, judgment, and an ongoing consequence that bleeds into later theology. And in Jubilees, another ancient work tied to this interpretive world, the Watchers are framed as beings who descended to instruct humanity, which aligns with the dangerous knowledge theme. That word, instruct, is a problem for the symbolic-only reading, because instruction implies transfer, transfer implies content, content implies risk. Now, what are the problems with theory B? There's no direct physical evidence, no artifact that says Watchers were here, no indisputable archaeological signature. But the lingering question remains powerful. What was important enough to survive suppression? Because the survival of a story is not neutral. Stories survive because they are useful, or because they're feared. And this one has been treated repeatedly as dangerous. Theory C, the forbidden knowledge hypotheses. This is the version that gets ridiculed fastest, not because it's been disproven in a clean way, but because it threatens too many frameworks at once. It challenges cosmology. It challenges authority. It challenges the psychological safety of the world makes sense. In Theory C, the Watcher's tradition is fundamentally about a breach, an unauthorized transfer of knowledge and power across a boundary. It's controversial because it suggests a hierarchy in which not all heavenly beings are aligned, not all authority is clean, and not all knowledge is meant for the current state of humanity. What evidence exists? Fragmented texts, early references, the geographic emphasis, and the strange persistence of this theme that knowledge can arrive too early, and when it doesn't liberate, it destabilizes. And why is it avoided? Because even entertaining it has social and institutional cost. It gets you labeled. It threatens the boundaries of what serious people are allowed to discuss. But here's the key question it raises. What knowledge was never meant to persist? And that question, whether you believe in the Watchers literally or not, should feel uncomfortably modern, because our world is full of knowledge that can be uninvented. This isn't an isolated case. Zoom out and you'll see the same structure repeating across centuries. Suppressed ancient texts later rediscovered. Events reframed from literal to symbolic. Knowledge restricted under the label of heresy. And the mechanism is always similar. First, the event exists in the record. Second, the record becomes controversial. Third, the approved interpretation is standardized. Fourth, alternatives are treated as fringe. And finally, the story survives anyway, but only as a rumor. Different centuries, different languages, but the same structure. The same institutions appear again and again, religious authorities and academic gatekeepers, each with legitimate reasons for caution, but also with incentives to preserve stability. The same explanations repeat: metaphor, myth, and non-literal. And the same outcomes show up: limited access, restricted discourse, and a story that can't be fully investigated because it has been turned into something untestable. Now, here's the twist. Mount Hermon isn't just ancient. It's still a strategic, contested, and heavily monitored mountain in the modern world, because geography doesn't stop mattering just because the story got old. Mount Hermon's summit straddles borders and has been treated as a strategic observation point in modern conflict. So the mountain survives in two worlds at once, as an ancient name that refuses to disappear, and as a modern high ground that powerful institutions still fight to hold. That doesn't prove the Watcher's narrative, but it reinforces the theme. Places like this become magnets for story, power, and control, because high ground always matters, whether you call it military or mythic. So why does this story create resistance? Why does Genesis 6 feel like a locked door in so many communities? Because belief isn't always about truth. Sometimes it's about stability. Authority bias is real. If the institution says settled, most people stop asking. Not because they're weak, because society requires trust to function. You can't independently verify everything. Fear of social cost is real. Questioning certain interpretations can come with labels: heretic, conspiracy theorist, unstable, and uneducated. People avoid that pain. Narrative fatigue is real. Ancient stories are dismissed as irrelevant because we're drowning in modern crisis. Who has time for an old mountain? And psychological comfort may be the most powerful force of all. Metaphor feels safer than consequence. If it's a metaphor, no one is accountable. If it's a metaphor, nothing crossed the line. And if it's a metaphor, the universe is tidy. But if the story is even partially rooted in something more than metaphor, if it preserves memory of boundary violation, then it implies something darker, that higher beings can fall, that authority can fracture, that knowledge can be weaponized, and the system itself can be compromised. And human beings don't like that. We prefer a universe with clean lines. But the oldest traditions often describe a universe with contested lines, and that is exactly why Mount Hermon matters. Because it functions like a scar, a location remembered because it marks a breach. So here's some questions with no answers. Why was this story geographically anchored? Who decided it was symbolic? Why did discomfort follow its preservation? What happens if the official version is incomplete? Why does First Enoch insist on an oath at a summit if none of it was meant to be taken seriously? Why do parallel traditions preserve the theme of instruction, knowledge transfer, if the story was only ever moral poetry? Why does the record keep circling the same mountain? And if the safe explanation is correct, if it's metaphor, why does the metaphor behave like a map? This episode isn't asking you to choose a theory. It's asking you to notice a pattern. Because the real issue isn't what people believe. It's who decides which questions are allowed. Mount Hermon is not just a mountain in a story. It's a test of how history gets domesticated, a test of how dangerous narratives get softened into harmless symbols, a test of how strange gets edited into the acceptable. And once you see the mechanism, you start seeing it everywhere. Not just in the ancient texts, in modern institutions, in modern narratives, in modern official explanations. That don't quite fit the shape of the record. The documents, timelines, and sources referenced here are linked below. Read them yourself, question carefully, and we'll continue this investigation in the next episode, because the mountain was remembered, and that means somebody, somewhere, didn't want it forgotten. Thank you for listening to The Broken Truth. Be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're listening on, share this episode, leave us a 5-star review, and drop your comments below. And as always, stay awake, stay aware, and stay questioning the narrative.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known. But you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is the broken truth, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.